She stepped onto the metro platform just like she did every evening, tired, distracted, and counting down the stops until she'd be home. Before we continue, please take some time to subscribe to Dailydose, like, and share this video. Becky, a 38-year-old nurse, had taken this exact route hundreds of times. But that night, everything would be different. Among the sea of strangers and flickering overhead lights, one man stood out, not because of anything he did at first, but because he wouldn't stop staring. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was nothing, but deep down, something felt off. What Becky didn't know was that this unsettling metro ride would mark the beginning of a story so unexpected, so haunting, and yet so moving, that by the end, tears would fill her eyes for a very different reason. The train car was crowded like usual, filled with commuters tucked into their own little bubbles. Becky stood in the far corner, scrolling through her phone. That's when she noticed him, a middle-aged man with short hair, standing halfway down the car, staring directly at her. At first, she assumed he must be looking past her, but when she turned her head to check, there was nothing there. It was her he was watching. She gave him an awkward smile, the kind that politely says, "Please stop." But it didn't work. He kept staring, unblinking, expression unreadable. When Becky reached her stop, she breathed a sigh of relief. The man didn't follow, at least not that she could tell. But as she walked home, an eerie sensation settled in. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching her. Shadows felt longer. Every echo behind her made her turn her head. It was nothing, she told herself, just her imagination. The next morning she hesitated before boarding the metro again, and when the doors opened, there he was, same man, same stare. It chilled her to the core. This time, she kept her eyes glued to the floor until her stop. She raced out the moment the doors opened. At work, she tried to bury herself in routine. Her hospital was fast-paced, always full of patients, noise, and controlled chaos. That day, it felt like her only safe space. But even that was temporary. When her shift ended, she lingered longer than usual, dreading the ride home. But eventually, she had to go. She stepped onto the metro, and her heart sank. He was there again. And worse, when she got off, so did he. She sped up her walk, so did he. He never got closer than 100 feet, but every time she turned a corner, he was still behind her. Becky's fear turned to panic. She sprinted the last blocks to her apartment. The moment she shut and locked the door, she collapsed against it, heart pounding. Safe, or so she thought. Peeking through the curtains a few minutes later, she froze. Across the street he was standing there, just standing, watching, not moving, like a statue. She called the police immediately, barely able to keep her voice steady. They assured her someone would be dispatched in 15 minutes, and exactly on the dot, the doorbell rang. But when Becky opened the door, it wasn't the police. It was him, the man from the metro, standing right there in front of her. Her heart nearly stopped. Before she could slam the door, he slid his foot between it and the frame. "Please, listen to me. I need your help," he said, voice trembling. Something in his tone stopped her. His face was pale, eyes red, like he hadn't slept in days. There was no aggression in him, just desperation. "How do you know my name?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "I met you at the hospital," he replied. That's when things took a strange turn. He explained how Becky had once helped him, well, not him directly, but his father. He had brought his elderly father to the hospital, where Becky had been one of the few people who treated them kindly. No one else seemed to care. But Becky did. Now, he said, his father was dying, and they'd been turned away by hospitals again and again. The treatment he needed was expensive and experimental, and every door had slammed shut. "You were our last light," the man David said, "and I didn't know how else to reach you." Reluctantly, Becky followed him to his home. Inside, she found an elderly man in a hospital bed, barely conscious. Becky could tell immediately his condition was severe, and there was nothing she could do. Or so she thought. Becky's instincts kicked in. Though overwhelmed, she remained calm as she checked the old man's vitals and observed his condition. David explained everything, how his father's illness had progressed, how every hospital visit ended in rejection due to insurance complications, and how Becky's kindness that one time had given them a glimmer of hope. He hadn't followed her to scare her. He followed her because he believed she was the only person who might care enough to help. That night, Becky couldn't sleep. The images of the frail man haunted her, along with David's trembling voice. So the next morning, she started calling in favors. She phoned Monica, a senior nurse and close friend at the hospital. Then she called administrators, doctors, and anyone she thought might help. But the answer was always the same. Nothing could be done without full insurance approval. The treatment, while available, was simply out of reach. Unable to sit back and do nothing, Becky started visiting David and his father daily. She brought basic medical supplies and pain medication from work. Though the treatment wasn't curative, it gave the old man comfort, and to David, it meant everything. Becky's small acts of compassion became a lifeline for the two men. Days turned into weeks, and while the disease remained, the presence of someone who cared kept them going. Then, the unexpected happened. A few weeks after Becky's first visit, David opened the door with tears in his eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "You won't believe what happened," he said, pulling her into a hug. A wealthy anonymous donor had read about their story in the local newspaper. One of Becky's colleagues, touched by her efforts, had written about it in a blog post that quickly spread. The donor offered to pay for the full cost of the experimental treatment, no strings attached. Becky was speechless. From that moment on, everything changed. The old man began treatment within days. The transformation was almost miraculous. With each passing week, his strength returned, the shakes subsided, the pain diminished, and 6 months later, Becky no longer needed to visit daily. But she still did. Not as a nurse this time, but as a friend. Over countless cups of coffee in their modest living room, the three of them forged a deep, quiet bond. One born out of fear, hope, and ultimately, kindness. The man who once terrified Becky had become someone she trusted, and the elderly father who once seemed on death's doorstep now welcomed her with a warm smile and a steady handshake. Becky never expected her life to be changed by a glance from a stranger on a train, but that's exactly what happened. What began as a moment of fear turned into a story of compassion, resilience, and the power of human connection. None of it would have happened if she hadn't listened, if she hadn't looked past the fear and seen a man desperately trying to save his father. And that's what made all the difference.